Hi, Sylvain from BERNINA. You know that the last step between making a garment and wearing it is sewing on the buttons. And by hand it takes a while. Well, what if I told you that you could put decorative buttons, regular plain buttons, 2 holes, 4 holes, regardless, faster, and that they would come out accurately placed and stitched with securing stitches? That's done with the Button Sew-On program, which is made possible by foot number 18, the Button Sew-On Foot. Let me show you at the bench and on the machine how it's designed and how it works, so you get buttons the quick way, efficiently, every time. Before we use foot number 18, let's review its anatomy. First, you'll notice the black rubber pads here that allow the foot to get a grip, if you want, on the button. Because buttons can be somewhat irregular in shape, this stabilizes the foot over the button while stitching. Then you have this pin here. When the zigzag going through the holes of the button stitches down, it will be forced up a little bit by this pin, which will create a thread shank. That's something you need to do in order for the other placket on top to come, with the buttonholes, right, to come under the button when you are all buttoned up. That pin can be moved up and down by loosening the screw on the side just a little bit. Then you can see that the pin can be moved up or down about 1/8 of an inch. The resulting longer thread shank would be used for, let's say, outerwear like a heavy jacket, where you need a longer thread shank for the bigger buttons and the thicker plackets to get under it. So that is adjustable. One more thing you can do. If you do not need the pin to create a shank, for instance, if you are sewing a decorative button on a surface and you don't want it to flop around, you want to basically take the pin out of service. To do so is simple. Unscrew the screw completely and then swivel the pin by the ankle and just swivel it up. Notice that the screw goes in on the right and it has a reciprocal hole here that is threaded for the screw to fasten to on the other side. And here's a groove with a pin that allows to both slide up and swivel. So once you've swiveled the pin out of the way, to fasten it, make sure that it stays snug against the shank of the foot. You don't want to push on the pin because you might bend it if you're strong enough. So just hold it by the ankle portion here and put the pressure across the bottom here. Then just reinsert the screw and fasten it until it's good and tight, because there is no screwdriver socket here on the screw itself, so you need to do it by hand. Now the pin is out of service on the front, and as you stitch, it will be completely out of the way. If you don't tighten the screw, there's a risk of the pin coming down. So make sure this is nice and snug when you disengage the pin. When you are done, you do the same thing in reverse. If you need to have your next set of buttons with a shank, you remove the screw, swivel the ankle down, and then just reinsert. And at this point, all the holes lined up, so there's only one way to do it. And when you retighten that screw, you now have a thread shank forming when you stitch a button, and you can slide it up and down again to get the shank at the thread shank at the length that you need. Before we sew on a button, let's review a couple of facts about buttons. You have your 2 basic varieties that you typically encounter, which is 2 holes versus 4 holes, and I'll stitch both of these down. Another thing you'll notice is that some of them are flat on the bottom, whether they are regular factory type buttons or decorative, and many of them are slightly rounded on the bottom, which distributes the stress, the pressure on the placket, the top placket, when you button, let's say, the shirt up. So to prevent any shifting of the button while sewing, regardless of whether it's flat or irregular shaped, the number one thing to do when you start is to make sure that you drop the feed dog. If you have an 8 series machine, it will do that for you. So now that we have the basic button anatomy in place, the last thing to mention about buttons is that the vast majority of factory-made buttons have the same spacing between the holes, whether there are 2 or 4 of them. That means that you can pre-program a button sew-on program, and it will automatically work with this spacing. Now let's sew on a button. I use my freehand system every time for this because it makes the work a lot easier. I can position the button under the foot and make sure that it's working. Make a note that the button sew-on program is preset at the factory to be a width of 4 millimeters is what you need for your average button. But for safety, I always hold my thread tail when I start on the side here, and then I will hand walk the wheel to make sure that I am in the button. And if I were not completely centered in the button, I could lift the freehand system and nudge just enough to reposition the button. And I will complete one stitch. You notice that the program is locking the stitch when it starts, and then verify that the needle will go into the second hole. And here you see that my thread tail came up from underneath. If that happens, you just pull it and put it next to the other one. When you are done, you can actually just press the start stop button if you have one, or use the foot control. The machine will stitch the program and lock the stitches automatically. At this point, you have two options. You can use a thread cutter. The stitches are secured on the last hole. Or you can pull, lift, release the button off the pin, and pull a nice long set of thread tails and cut them so that you can now use a tapestry needle and send these tails to the bottom and tie them together. That's good for long hardware buttons, like maybe at the belt closing of jeans, on something that gets open and closed a lot, so you can actually tie them if you want to. But the stitches are secured when you stitch it with the program. Here you can see that thanks to the pin raising the thread shank, you have clearance under the button so that when you bring in the second side, the second placket, it will fit under the button without stressing the point and without creating these dimples. Now let's sew a 4-hole button. When sewing a 4-hole button, you always sew the front holes if you want the ones near you first. If you don't, if you sew the back ones first, when you want to move forward, the thread shank would form here and butt against the foot and prevent you from moving the project. So always start at the front, and then I will do the usual. I will hold my thread tail and I will test that position of the needle to make sure that it's going into the hole properly. And then when that's done, I can use the start stop button and just let the machine do it. When I am done, I can actually, at this point, lift with the presser foot lifter, the knee bar, and then move towards the back holes. And again, just verify that I'm going to go into the hole, and that is good. So I can now stitch it and finish it. At this point, there's one little crossover thread here, which does not matter because the stitches are secured on both of these stitching rounds. So at this point, I can just pull everything off, and I have a 4-hole button again with clearance underneath for a placket, and I can send these threads down under and tie them if I need to for hard wearing items. Now, next we'll talk about when you don't need a thread shank. Here's an example of sewing a decorative button on the project as a decorative element. So in this case, I don't need a thread shank. I want the button to be nice and tight against the project. So without the pin in place, I still have a bit of a visual guide. This little socket here, if you want, where the pin would normally sit, gives me an alignment for the center. And then the back of the metal pieces here show me that the needle will be in front of them. So at this point, I can test whether my needle will go, and it went in the right hole. I will always test to the second hole just to be sure. That's an old practice from my old mechanical Bernina days. And then when that's done, I can actually sew this down. And when it's done, this is decorative. It's not going to go through a buttonhole all the time. So I could cut, or what I will do is I will pull, and then I will just trim close. That button, as you can see, is very flush to the fabric. It's tighter than it was if there had been a pin above creating the thread shank. So that would be just a floating button on my surface, but it's properly fastened. So that's foot number 18. Simple design, optimized for sewing on buttons. But it will help stabilize the button. It lets you create a thread shank to the height that you want. You can even take the shank maker if you want the pin out of service so that you can do a snug button if you need to. The rest is very straightforward. My key ingredients for success are, number 1, drop the feed dog. You don't want them banging on the back of the button while you're trying to stitch it down, right? Number 2, always test by hand with the first hole to verify that you lined up properly and adjust if you need to. Then the rest is moderate speed and let the program finish. Then you can either cut the threads flush with the button when you're done. The threads have been secured. Or you can send the threads to the bottom if you want, through the button, back under, where you can tie the tails together. That I use for hardware items when I know the button will go hundreds of times through that buttonhole. That way it will help. A couple of things. The program is at 4mm stitch width, which is what you want for the standard buttons, which is most of them. If your machine does not have a button sew-on program, like an older mechanical, or my old 1260 Bernina, then you can set your zigzag at 4mm and it will work with this foot. You will just have to move your straight stitch through the needle position where it goes into the hole of the buttons if you want to secure stitches. But otherwise, the zigzag itself will work at a width of 4mm. There is a version of this foot for older machines made prior to 1997, prior to needle threaders. So it is a little different. The shank maker, the pin slides up and down and can be removed. It just looks different. So if you have an older machine and you want to take advantage of a button sew-on foot, it is available to you as well. So in conclusion, foot designed for the job, works every time. That's the Bernina way. So may your buttons be sewn properly, and we'll see you next time.